He's been on the Oakland County Historical Commission since 2005, and he's currently working on a series of books and associated lectures that are designed to tell important but underappreciated bits of American history, like the Chautauqua movement, and to do so from a somewhat local perspective. His view is that both local history and American history can be better understood by recognizing that all history has its local ramifications. Two of the books that he's written, New York's Burned Over District, Revival, Reform, and the Migration to Michigan, and The Good Roads Movement in Michigan, are completed, and his third on the Chautauqua movement is in process. Please help me welcome Jim Kraft.
Okay. First of all, how many of you have ever been to a Chautauqua? Okay, cool. How many have ever been to Bayview?
Up north?
Yeah, Bayview. That's a Chautauqua. How many have ever been to Lakeside in northern Ohio? That's a Chautauqua. So, more of you have been to Chautauqua than you think. Hopefully you got a chance to read that. We'll refer back to President Garfield's comment on several occasions throughout the day, but this is obviously a talk about Chautauqua. Chautauquas still exist. They started in the 1870s. There are about 15 or so that go back into the 1880s and still exist. One is Bayview, one is Chautauqua, one is Chautauqua, New York. And then there's one actually, sort of, a Chautauqua still in Ludington, Epworth Heights in Ludington. You can talk about the Chautauqua movement, I think, in a couple of different ways. One way is to just kind of drop it into leisure in America. If you wrote a book on leisure in America at the turn of the century, you might have a chapter on national parks, you might have a chapter on railroad hotels, you might have a chapter on bathing beaches circa Coney Island. You might have a chapter on golf and tennis, personal sports, or spectator sports like baseball and football. And you may have a chapter on amusement parks and circuses. And you also may have a chapter on Chautauqua. And in such a book, Chautauqua would be treated as a resort for middle-class Protestants. And that would be the presentation. That's true, but there's a lot more to Chautauqua than just that. That would be a very superficial and to me, irrelevant kind of presentation of what Chautauqua was all about. Basically, what Chautauqua came to be is it was a movement that for 50 years kind of represented the view of old stock, middle-class Americans, their view of the world, and it was a place from which they formulated a lot of their responses to the changes that were going on in industrializing America. The progressive movement that I'm sure all of you are at least somewhat familiar with was the Great Reform movement at the turn of the century. And you can make the case that Chautauqua was the platform from which the progressive movement pronounced its ideas. Chautauqua was a terribly important event in American history, but it's, as kind of Stephanie mentioned, it's something that's very much underappreciated and underrecognized. There are really four Chautauquas that we're going to talk about today. First is what is typically referred to as the Mother Chautauqua. This is where it all started. This is kind of the epitome of Chautauqua. It's located on Lake Chautauqua in western New York. Then there were a great series of independent Chautauquas, Bayview, Lakeside, Epworth being three of them, that were established essentially in imitation of the Chautauqua in New York. Then there was an at-home version of Chautauqua, the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circles. This was essentially a correspondence program that we'll get to in a bit, but that was kind of the at-home version of Chautauqua that reached people all over the country. And then the aspect of Chautauqua that probably had the most participants would be the circuit Chautauquas, also referred to sometimes as tent Chautauquas or traveling Chautauquas. These got started around, well, first one's really in 1904, but doesn't really kick off until 1907, and lasts until around 1930. but the traveling Chautauquas were visited annually by tens of millions of people for 20, 30 years. Yes?
Because I've gone to my lakeside Chautauqua for 30 years and listened to a lot of talks about this movement, I mean, you probably do know that our Chautauqua had the first meeting, although it was intense, and then the Chautauqua, New York had their meeting next, and then they did build the first permanent building, but we were not exactly an imitation of them, we were for them.
Yes, you were. We'll get to that. All right. In order to understand Chautauqua, I think you need to put it into the proper context. As a historian, I like to put things in context. So the Chautauqua, at least the phase of the Chautauqua movement that we're going to be talking about, kind of begins sort of in 1874, and we're going to end it at basically at the start of the Depression in 1930, 1929. But the key thing here is we'll get to questions at the back end. This is tough enough for me to try and jam this into 50 minutes. So my wife's been listening to me do this for the last 3 days, and 50 minutes is a struggle. So the first thing is the Second Great Awakening. This was the great religious revival that swept through the United States in the first half of the 19th century and created Protestant America that we think of today. And it replaced the Protestant America of colonial times, which was heavily, very strongly Calvinistic. The two leading denominations would have been the Presbyterians, and then in New England, the Congregationalists. The Second Great Awakening kind of undercut the strong Calvinist views of those denominations. It brought to the forefront two very minor denominations during colonial America, the Methodists and the Baptists, so that by 1850, Methodists and Baptists were by far the largest two denominations in the country. The Second Great Awakening also brought about kind of uniquely American Protestant churches, particularly the Christian churches, the Disciples of Christ, the Mormons, and the Adventists were all outgrowths of the Second Great Awakening. In addition to that, the very democratic, grassroots, decentralized, Bible-centric aspect of the evangelical Protestant Second Great Awakening resulted in essentially the fracturing of all of the denominations. And one of the characteristics of American Protestantism today is the fact that there's hundreds of denominations, there's hundreds of churches that are all independent. It's not a question of having one Church of England or something like that. We have lots of denominations in this country. And it kind of springs from the Second Great Awakening. One of the really important features for our purposes of the Second Great Awakening is the emphasis on the end of time cycle. That is, there will be a millennium, the 1,000 years of peace and harmony, there will be a second coming of Christ, and there will be the last judgment and the end of times. People of the Second Great Awakening more or less believed that the millennium was going to begin in the United States, and it was going to happen fairly soon. And in fact, if Americans played their cards right and stamped out sin in the United States and evil in the United States, we could expedite the coming of the millennium. That led to the first great reform movement in American history, an effort to kind of perfect American society, to make it the fit place for the millennium to begin. The temperance movement, the women's rights movement, public education, campaigns to improve prisons and mental institutions. Most importantly, the great sin in America, at least if you were a Northerner in 1830, 1840, would of course be slavery. The anti-slavery crusade is, well, you can't say it starts with the Second Great Awakening, but clearly the people of the Second Great Awakening kind of co-opted the anti-slavery movement, and the race towards the Civil War was essentially the people, Northerners of the Second Great Awakening, who saw slavery as the great sin of American society. So that's the Second Great Awakening. And the point is, the children of the people of the Second Great Awakening, their children and their grandchildren, are the people who went to Chautauqua. Okay? Now, one of the things, or the other major thing that's going on in the 19th century, a little bit later, starting in, say, 1820, maybe 1830, is the Industrial Revolution is kicking off in the United States. And for the rest of the century, and well into the 20th century, industrialization, the resulting urbanization, and the attraction of immigrants to the United States to fuel the Industrial Revolution are the main stories in trying to understand American history. This kind of reaches a climax as you move into the latter part of the 19th century because of the kind of the nasty ramifications of all of this. We'll get to that in just a moment. Now, industrialization was very much a result of the rise of science and the Enlightenment and scientific explanations for what's going on in the world. This is very much in conflict with the biblical explanation of the world that the people of the Second Great Awakening believed. This can be best illustrated by the coming of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859. That's obviously very much in conflict with the biblical teaching of the origin of the earth. But this conflict with science is another one of the features that's going on here. The people of the Second Great Awakening were rural, agricultural, Bible-centric. Then along comes industrialization, urbanization, the rise of science, and a flood of people who were not old stock evangelical Protestants. Prior to the Civil War, they were Irish Catholics, and German Lutherans. They weren't Anglo-Saxon Protestants. After the Civil War, it's millions of people coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, Catholics, Jewish, and Orthodox. They weren't Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And the rise of science and the teaching of Charles Darwin. The point is, the people of the Second Great Awakening, no sooner had they come to be the dominant group in American society than the challenges of the Industrial Revolution kind of hit them. Now, one of the interesting things about the Industrial Revolution is this creates the leisure that James Garfield talked about in that first slide. It really isn't until the Industrial Revolution that significant numbers of people had leisure and the money to do something with that leisure time. The great group that, there's always been rich, but this now becomes a feature of middle-class life, leisure time, and money to do something with leisure time. And then in 1861, along comes the Civil War. The Civil War was very much a consequence of the people of the Second Great Awakening and their campaign against slavery. Many would have looked at the success that successfully stamping out slavery would be a catalyst to the millennium. Obviously, that didn't happen. In fact, what happened after the Civil War is things got worse because not only did the Civil War end slavery, it was a huge catalyst for the growth of industry in this country. So the post-Civil War era for the people of the Second Great Awakening was kind of a disappointment. Slavery was ended, but blacks were not really free. The America had become increasingly this urban industrial machine, and we're no closer to the millennium than we were 20 years earlier. Again, it's the children of the Second Great Awakening. They're the ones that marched off and went to war. 600,000 people died in the Civil War. The consequences were not what they anticipated going in. Blacks remained essentially in servitude. The old stock, or the pre-Civil War white leadership just resumed their control of Southern affairs. So to some extent, what did we do this for? You can make the case that after the Civil War, this group, not the people of the Second Great Awakening, they're dead by now, but their children and their grandchildren are the ones that kind of move off to Chautauqua to some extent to kind of understand what's going on in the world around them. This is a very different world now. And to formulate a response to the horrible conditions that had come about as a result of industrialization and urbanization. Slums, working conditions, child labor, I mean, all kinds of problems that American society had. The response to that was the progressive movement, and much of that response was formulated by people who were very closely associated with the Chautauqua movement, and quite certainly the Chautauqua movement was the platform from which this campaign was pronounced, not exclusively, but it was extremely important in that regard. So, what is Chautauqua? First of all, it's a place. Chautauqua is a lake in western New York. The Chautauqua Institute is located on a little peninsula called Fairpoint on the western shore of Lake Chautauqua. So that's one definition of Chautauqua. Today, people in the Chautauqua movement would talk about the 4 pillars of Chautauqua. Now, I'm not exactly sure when the term the 4 pillars started to come into play, but quite certainly the concepts were there almost from the beginning. Religion, education, the arts, and recreation. Those are the 4 pillars of Chautauqua. Chautauqua is an event. To some extent, it's a religious revival. To some extent, it's a resort. And don't forget that. It is a resort. Okay? This is a place of recreation. It's a summer school. It can be a music and arts festival. And in many cases, especially in this era, it was a place where current events were a subject of discussion. If you go to Chautauqua's today, there will be this aspect of discussing current events. That's a part of the puzzle. Chautauqua is really all of these things. If you were going to, I think one of the ways to think about what a Chautauqua is try to build one. Let's start one from scratch. So to do this, I guess what we're going to do is we're going to go about 400 or 500 acres up on Higgins Lake. You got to have a big chunk of land. It's got to be in a nice bucolic setting. It's probably on water. So we're going to buy 500 acres of land on Higgins Lake. And we're going to fence it in. Okay? It's enclosed. It's a gated community. And we're going to start building cottages. Now, for a while, people are just going to have to live in tents until we get all the cottages built. But we're going to build cottages. They're going to be simple structures. These aren't going to be massive cottages, the kind that we see today on Burt Lake and stuff like that. These are very simple cottages, half the size of this room, probably with a second floor. We're going to have to build some communal buildings. First and foremost is going to be a great auditorium where people can sit and listen to religious services, lectures, entertainments, music, but that's going to be a central feature. We need to have some kind of a hotel. Simple, the rooms will be simple, but there'll be a lot of them, and there's going to be a great porch and a big dining hall and a big reading room. And we're probably going to have a building with some classrooms in it, okay? Because this is about education, remember. And then we're going to have to bring in speakers. Where are we going to get those? In today's world, we'll probably hook up with some speakers bureau and kind of go pick from a list of speakers that we want to come in. And we're certainly going to hook up with Palace Entertainment to arrange our entertainment. And they'll kind of book in acts to come in and entertain us at Chautauqua. These won't be top acts. These will kind of second-tier acts because we can't afford the big guys. But we'll get a lot of entertainment through the summer. Or maybe we're going to hook up with George Perot III and get him to show up on Thursday afternoons to do the American Adventure Series, because Chautauqua is like travelogues. And because we're going to be a big Chautauqua, we're going to have a regular summer school program. And what we'll do is we'll hook up with a college like Albion College, and they will come in and provide professors and instructors and run a whole series of mini courses throughout the summer. Albion provided that service at Bayview for 50 years. We'll probably get Interlochen to kind of sponsor the music training because people need to learn how to play instruments, to sing. They'll perform for us on occasion. We'll get Face the Nation to do their Sunday morning show on our stage on Sunday mornings. We're going to have a reading club, and again, we'll just kind of tap into Oprah's reading club, and we'll just use that. We may get the DIA to have regular programs here. We're certainly going to have a minister, and typically this is going to be a minister a week. And that minister will be responsible not only for Sunday services, but also a morning service every day, maybe evening vesters, and probably some kind of a lecture every day on kind of how a Christian should deal with events of the day. We'll get the YMCA to come in and organize an athletic program, probably a youth camp. We're certainly going to have a Bible school for kids. And that's it. There's our Chautauqua. Okay? Your day at Chautauqua will look like this. You've had days just like this. Most of your days are just like this at Lakeside. I've had many days just like this at Chautauqua's. You get up in the morning, you maybe go for a quick stroll. You go for breakfast, probably, or maybe, you go for maybe morning prayer service overlooking the lake. You go to breakfast, probably in the dining hall. Then afterwards, you've got a book club session that's going to run from 9 till 10:30. And then immediately after that, you've got a lecture by some prominent individual. Jacob Riis. You may have heard of Jacob Riis, the photographer who took all kinds of photographs of slums in New York City at the turn of the century. He was a regular visitor to Chautauqua. So you go hear him speak. And then you go to lunch. After lunch, which you may have had in your own little cottage, or you may did it at the dining hall. You probably sit on the porch and maybe take a little nap while you're trying to read a book, and then off you go to your art class. And then after your art class, you go down and play shuffleboard for a bit. And then you go to dinner, and after dinner, you kind of go for a quick stroll, stop for evening vespers, and then there's the night's entertainment. That's a day at Chautauqua. Pardon? It is great. It is great. It's what why James Garfield said that the Chautauquans figured this out. This is what leisure should be. In any event, where does the Chautauqua movement really come from? Well, it's to some extent, it's the intersection of a couple of things that are going on immediately following the Civil War. First of all, you have to recognize that the people of the Second Great Awakening, their children, their grandchildren, were struggling with the outcome of the Civil War, the cost of the Civil War, and kind of, it didn't really produce what they had hoped for. By this time, the Second Great Awakening had kind of run its course by the 1840s. So they're kind of they're coasting. And in the post-Civil War era, there's the idea not that we need to have a great religious revival, because people are Christian, they are going to church, but we need to reinvigorate that Christianity. And so how are we going to do that? Well, one of the ways, and this is particularly true for the Methodists, for Methodist camp meetings were a central part of how they played out the Second Great Awakening. They were very effective in getting camp meetings. Well, after the Civil War, the Methodists started what came to be known as the camp meeting movement. And they began to establish permanent camp meeting sites. Now, they weren't intended as revivals in the same way that the camp meetings were of the Second Great Awakening. They were more like retreats to reinvigorate people's faith. And there were something like 150 of those institutions that were established around the country in the years immediately following the Civil War. How many have ever been to Romeo? Know where Campground Road is? Campground Road is Camp Simpson, which was one of these Methodist camps that was established in 1865. They never went down the Chautauqua path. They thought about it, they considered it in the 1890s, but they stayed as a Methodist camp meeting site. But many of these camp meeting sites that were created following the Civil War, they did go down the Chautauqua path. Any event, the second thing that's going on, again, it's a part of this reinvigoration of Christianity, evangelical Protestant Christianity in the post-Civil War era. The Sunday school movement goes back to England in the late 1700s. The American Sunday School Union gets started in the United States around 1817, 1818. And that was a big part of how you spread Christianity in America in the Second Great Awakening. Following the Civil War, there's a recognition that perhaps the Sunday schools aren't doing all they could. And so there's efforts to improve the quality of what's going on in these Sunday schools. And this brings to the table the two heroes of our story, Lewis Miller and John Hale Vincent. Miller was a manufacturer and inventor from Akron, Ohio. He made improvements to a hay rake and started producing the Buckeye hay rake. I hate to say the word Buckeye, but that's what he did. And he became a wealthy guy. By the way, the quick aside is his daughter married Thomas Edison. It was Edison's second wife. They met at Chautauqua. In any event, Miller he's a wealthy guy. He gets involved in community affairs in Akron, particularly in his church. He's a Methodist. His family had been converted in the early 1830s during the midst of the Second Great Awakening. And Miller basically grew up in that household, and he's active in the Methodist Church, in particular Sunday schools. And he initiates a number of very important reforms to the Sunday schools in Akron. That draws him to the attention of the head of the Methodist Sunday School Association, whatever, Reverend Vincent. Both of these guys wind up getting involved in the American Sunday School Union and become friends and colleagues in the early 1870s. They decide that one of the things that they could do in order to strengthen the Sunday school movement is maybe have some training sessions for Sunday school teachers. And so Miller basically is aware of this Methodist campground meeting that had gotten started at Lake Chautauqua at Fairpoint in the early 1870s. And he arranges for them to have a Sunday school training session at Fairpoint on Lake Chautauqua in August of 1874. It's a 2-week session. It is very successful. They come back the next year and do 3 weeks. That too is very successful. They come back the next year and do 4 weeks. By 1878, Miller and Vincent are starting to feel their oats. And they're really kind of looking to take this to the next level. Now, there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, Miller and Vincent were both self-made men. Neither one of them had a college education, and that bugged them. They felt that they had been cheated perhaps a bit. And they resented the fact that in mid-century America, only the wealthy went to college. And they thought that that was just not right. The second thing is that, they've been providing education and training to Sunday school teachers. But their belief was that all knowledge is God's knowledge. And that all knowledge, acquiring of knowledge is going to bring everybody closer to God, whether you're a Sunday school teacher or you're not a Sunday school teacher. And so they started to broaden their idea of what should be taught at their campground on the western shore of Lake Chautauqua. In addition to that, this is the point when the leisure is starting to become an accepted norm in American society, particularly for the middle class. And you start to rationalize that by saying, well, people need the relaxation. You need some R&R time so you can go back to your normal life with more enthusiasm. So the combination of these things, the self-made men looking to kind of create educational opportunities for the average citizen in America, the belief that knowledge is God's knowledge and that everybody should work to improve their knowledge of the world, and that there needs to be a place of rest and relaxation, leads to the establishment in 1878, really, of Chautauqua. Chautauqua really didn't start in 1874. The camp meeting, there were a number of camp meetings all over the country prior to the Civil War. And the Sunday school meetings, as near as I can tell, it starts at Chautauqua. Other people emulated that. But Chautauqua really starts in 1878. One of the key things that happened in 1878 is the creation of the Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle. This is the at-home version that I referred to. It is essentially a correspondence course. There is a directed reading list. It's a 4-year reading list of books. And then they began to publish the Chautauquan. This is 6 months of the Chautauquan magazine. There are about 150 pages, and trust me, there aren't any pictures in this book.
Oh my goodness.
All right? The table of contents is dense with amazing topics, at least amazing from my perspective. The people who live in Algiers, the extermination of American animals, child labor and some of its results. How can I become a distinct speaker? Divorce in the United States, a biography of Dorothea Dix, the French Constitution, the action of glaciers, Johnstown, and how sickness was prevented, and on it goes. The CLSC not only had these books that people were expected to read, but then they had a regular reading list every month. The idea was you do the reading, and then you get together in a group, a circle, that would be established in your own community. And there would be a discussion format that would be sent out to each of these circles. They'd all have their books, they'd all get the Chautauqua magazine, they'd do the reading, they'd have their discussions, and then there would be examinations eventually. And after 4 years, if you pass the examinations, you get your certification. It isn't a diploma exactly, but it's something close. It was, in effect, a liberal arts degree. Okay. Curiously, this diploma was issued in 2009 at Lakeside. Okay. The CLSC still exists.
We usually have about 3 or 4 people a year who get theirs.
Yeah. Now, one of the things about the CLSC is Vincent Miller looked at this to some extent as kind of a continuation, although an expansion and an improvement on efforts of the early 19th century, late 18th century actually in England, to provide education for the working man, working men's institutes. Okay? This was expected to be a little bit of that. But as it turns out, about 70 or 80% of the people who participated in the CLSC were women. Now why? Well, because middle-class women had time on their hands. They couldn't work, they had servants, what the hell are you going to do? Let's start a CLSC, right? And so women wound up playing a major role in the CLSC and frankly in Chautauqua generally. The first graduating class of the CLSC was 4 years after 1878, so 1882. By 1893, there had been 27,000 female graduates of the CLSC. In that time frame, there were something like 32,000 graduates, female graduates from all colleges in the United States. By 1900, there had been 10,000 circles that existed around the country. Each of them would have had, a half a dozen, 20 people that were part of their circle. Now, these things didn't last, generally speaking, for 20 years. Although, frankly, I tracked down the records of a CLSC group in Fenton that had gone on from I don't know, the 19-teens until 1960. Wow. The same group had been in operation. In my experience in looking some of this stuff over, I don't think most of them lasted that long. They kind of came and went. But, you can see some of the numbers here. The thing is that whatever numbers you have are understatements because you're going to get a lot of people that showed up at these events. They borrowed somebody's book. They borrowed the Chautauqua. They did the readings. They participated in the discussions. They never got their diplomas because they didn't pay the fee or they didn't stick it out. But there were still a lot of people participating in this. This, again, gives you a little bit of an idea. This is 1 month's reading assignment. And then, again, there's discussion documents, examinations that kind of go along with all of this. I think the CLSC is important for a lot of reasons, but one of the things is that this starts to play, I think, a pivotal role in what happens in the last part of the 19th century in the progressive movement. One of the key forces in the progressive movement were the women's clubs. Women played a very big role in the progressive movement. It's hard to make the direct connection here. I've read some authors who have done some of this research, and they will make the connection between the CLSC and the women's club movement. I have not personally done a lot of that research, but I think it's there. Kind of the base education people get in the CLSC, they get knowledge of what's going on in the world, they start working with other women, and they start to take on issues. They get involved in the women's club, they start addressing community issues, and pretty soon they're part of the key reformers of the progressive movement. Now, to be honest, women were especially concerned with suffrage and the temperance movement. But child labor, playgrounds, the bathhouses, there were all kinds of things that people got involved in to improve society in the last half of the 19th century, and women were right in the middle of it. And I think the CLSC plays a heavy role as a catalyst for all of this. That's not the only thing that gets started in 1878. By the early 1880s, Chautauqua had a university up and running in New York. They actually were licensed by the state of New York to issue bachelor degrees. They never did, but they had 30, 40, 50 professors from major universities coming in and spending the summer teaching mini courses. There was a great language program. It started off with Bible languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, and then into modern languages, French, German, Spanish. Full-blown music and arts programs, children's programs, athletic programs, and then, of course, the platform for these speakers to come in and talk about current events. Jane Addams, Richard Ely, Jacob Riis, you name it. They went to Chautauqua and gave presentations. Okay. How are we doing? Just very quickly, some of the visual looks here. The first auditorium at Chautauqua was on the left. This is what it looked like about 1900. Today, this summer, they were rebuilding the auditorium at Chautauqua. They start off in tents, and then they start building tents with wooden walls, these little cottages. Now today, many places you'll see very fancy cottages at Chautauqua's, but they start off as these very simple things. Lots of public spaces. A hall for lectures, a small hall for lectures, the hotel at Chautauqua, the park along Lake Chautauqua. There's a men's club there on the left. The boat house is there on the right where you can see the steamship that's kind of docked up there. That's probably, 1885, 1890, something like that. Now, Chautauqua in New York is a big deal. They do a lot. It's still around. You can go there today, and it is a wonderful experience. But the success of Chautauqua, and again, I don't mean the 1874 founding of Chautauqua with the Sunday school stuff. It's really what happens after 1878 that creates Chautauqua. That's Chautauqua. That was very successful, and increasingly other Methodist camp meeting sites began to emulate. The first Chautauquas outside of Chautauqua, New York, were these Methodist camp meeting sites. There were about 25 of them that kind of adopted the Chautauqua format. Now, they didn't necessarily have full summer sessions. Maybe they were just 2 or 3 weeks, but some were full summer sessions, okay, like they had at Chautauqua. Bayview and Lakeside and Epworth were places where they had full summer Chautauquas. There was no official connection with the mother Chautauqua. If somebody wanted to take the name Chautauqua and use it, they did, okay? And it wasn't copyrighted, this wasn't a franchise. There were times when Vincent or others would go out and kind of, visit some of these places, but by and large, people operated on their own. Now, what you will find in the Chautauquan magazine is plenty of reference to all of these different Chautauquas around the country. So Bayview's in there every year, Lakeside's in there every year. But many of them had different origins. Initially, it's these Methodist camp meeting sites that start to morph into becoming Chautauquas. But there are about 25 of the 150 that were established that went down the Chautauqua path. Most did not, like Simpson Park Camp out in Romeo. That did not go down the Chautauqua path. Many of them did have religious connections that got them started. They weren't necessarily Methodist, but they almost invariably were evangelical Protestant, although in the 1890s there was a Catholic Chautauqua that got started up in northern New York. There was a Jewish Chautauqua that got started, I can't remember exactly where that one was, but around 1900. But most of these, almost all of them, with a couple exceptions, were evangelical Protestant connections. But they weren't necessarily closely tied to the church at all. They were kind of non-denominational. Oftentimes, and again, one of the things that happens, these places were always sited on water in bucolic settings. They were resort areas. And a lot of the Chautauquas that got started were started because the local communities thought it would be a good idea to have a Chautauqua in their town, to bring business to town. Railroads and interurbans were invariably involved in getting these things laid out because they wanted ridership. Okay? By 1900, there were probably 100 to 120 Chautauquas. It's really difficult to get a good number. There's a guy that has read some of his stuff. He claims that there was north of 300 Chautauquas. I think that's really a stretch. I think what happened is he may have found 300 places where a Chautauqua lasted for a season, but it was really never a permanent Chautauqua. As near as I can tell, we're probably talking 100 to 120 around 1900, but by 1900, there's a number of them that already had gone belly up. So this isn't 100 that lasted for 20 years. It's rather at any given snapshot in this era, you probably had about 100 independent Chautauquas operating. They might go for a couple of weeks, they might go all summer, but around 1900, you'd have had somewhere close to 1 million people, not residents of a Chautauqua necessarily, but visitors to Chautauqua programs over the course of the summer. This is at a time when the population of the United States is somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 million. We've already talked about Bayview, Epworth, and we didn't mention Lake Orion. Lake Orion had a Chautauqua that started, this was basically a group of Methodists from Detroit bought land at an existing resort area. Lake Orion was a resort area already. And these guys bought in. They ran a Chautauqua up there until about 1905 when they sold out. The new owners kept the Chautauqua going for a few years. But then that closed. The one on Lake Fenton, I think it's Lake Fenton, it used to be called Long Lake, and Muskegon, I think are two examples of these Chautauquas that lasted for a year or two, and that's it. They're both mentioned by Reverend Vincent, so they existed, but they just didn't exist very long. So those are the 5 that I can identify in Michigan, 2 of which still exist. This is Bayview at the beginning. There's the speaker's platform, there's the tent. Within a few years, they built Chautauqua Hall, which is that top thing on the left. On the bottom, in 1910, they built John M. Hall Auditorium. John M. Hall was one of the big leaders of Bayview off and on, and I always think that they really missed an opportunity. If my name was Hall and they're going to name a building after me, I want it called Hall. I want it John M. Hall. But I think they just messed up. And then there you can see an example of a cottage that's morphed over time. It's now a very comfortable thing, but you can imagine what it looked like to begin with. Okay? This is kind of interesting. I stuck this on here because one of the things that Chautauquas do is they start to play a role in the city's beautiful movement or things like that. It's what is it that cities and suburbs should look like in this modern era. This looks like a suburb layout. The winding streets, manicured, landscaped. Actually, Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park and other public spaces in the country, he got involved in some Chautauquas. And his company got involved in Chautauquas, laying them out. But you see, the meandering streets, there's the central compound with a library, a museum, the auditorium, the post office, the business center of the community. Again, I emphasize library and museum. And then parks scattered around the area. Okay? If you've ever been up to, haven't had a chance, go to Bayview. It's a beautiful spot. Okay? Any event, there is that piece of Chautauqua. And then the Bayview Reading Club, actually John M. Hall of John M. Hall fame, he started his own reading group. He had been a prime advocate, and Vincent singled him out as the guy who was spreading the CLSC in Michigan, but Hall created kind of his own version. It was very much geography oriented and about countries and that sort of thing. In any event, the Bayview Reading Club. They had a college since 1886. In 1892, 90 courses, 790 students, and 42 professors. Okay. Eventually, Albion sort of takes over the program. This is at a time when there really were no universities in northern Michigan, and it becomes, to a certain extent, where teachers went for extended learning in the summer months. That seems to be the principal audience for Albion or Bayview University. Today, the big thing going at Bayview is really their music program. They do have the other things going on, but pretty small. It's not a full-blown Chautauqua in my view, but they do have a very significant music program going on up there. If you get a chance, go spend the night at the Terrace Inn. Look at the schedule. I mean, it's just, you're stepping back 100 years. It's beautiful. This is Epworth Heights, probably around 1900. It gets started because the people of Ludington, and this is very typical of Chautauquas, the later Chautauquas. The people of Ludington were going out of business because the lumber boom is over. The railroad is looking for ridership. So what do? They go to Reed City, where the Epworth League had a Methodist camp meeting, and talked them into relocating to Ludington. The city fathers gave them land, the railroad gave them money, and they moved to Ludington. And it still exists, although they stopped functioning as a Chautauqua in 1924. They still do some little bits. They do have a minister that comes in every week. Is the only resident in the hotel nowadays. But it's really basically a private resort. It's beautiful, but it's really no longer really a Chautauqua. This, again, I put this up here because, again, it gives you a look at the kind of the subdivision look of many of these Chautauquas. This is pretty typical. Lake Orion we kind of talked about already. This is the big hotel that they built. Again, all these places have hotels with great big verandas, dining, sort of thing. And then here's Lakeside. Again, it's one of these places that starts as a Methodist camp meeting and then kind of moves in the direction of Chautauqua in the 1870s. There's the great hotel, the Lakeside Hotel right here. It's a beautiful place, great big front porch, big sitting room, nice big dining hall. This is an early version of the auditorium. The auditorium today can seat, 4,000 people? 2,500 people. Some of the auditoriums at these Chautauquas could seat north of 12,000 people. I think Chautauqua is about 8,000. Hall Auditorium, I think, is about 2,000. I thought Lakeside was a little bigger. Sure seems bigger. But it's covered. It's completely enclosed, whereas the one at Chautauqua is not enclosed. It's more like this one. It's covered, but it's not enclosed. And there's Simpson Park. So those are the independent Chautauquas. You have the Mother Chautauqua, you have the CLSC, and then you have the independent Chautauquas. And then in 1904, things begin to change a bit. Now, one of the things that the independent Chautauquas and the Mother Chautauqua had to do is to get talent in. They needed speakers, and they needed to get entertainment in. That got to be a real difficult thing for these independent Chautauquas to do. And so increasingly, a lot of them began to turn to the Lyceum booking agents. Lyceums got started in the 1820s in Boston. It was essentially kind of an adult education winter program. They bring in lecturers, they bring in entertainment on winter evenings. Ralph Waldo Emerson, his biggest source of income was probably as a Lyceum speaker. Mark Twain was booked by Lyceum booking agents. Jenny Lind, when she'd travel the world, travel the United States, was often booked through these Lyceum booking agents. The point is that it became a lot easier for these independents to work through the Lyceum booking agents to get their talent than it was for them to go out and try to scramble to get this stuff on their own. One of the largest, I think, was the Red Path, the Lyceum Bureau. That was, I think, the largest. It had been going on, it had been existed since at least 1868. I thought it was a little bit earlier, but I saw something recently, it was 1868. In any event, the Lyceum, the Red Path booking agent in Iowa was a guy by the name of Keith Vautar. I worked with a Brian Vautar, so I always get screwed up on this one. Keith Vautar was the booking agent in Iowa, and he had this great idea that why doesn't he put together a full program of speakers and entertainment and sell the whole package to the independent Chautauquas in Iowa. There were 15 of them at the time. He got, I think, 9 of them to bite in 1904. He filled out his program by going to towns that had never had Chautauquas and said, listen, I'll put up a tent and put on a 1-week Chautauqua. You just have to kind of pay the bill. All right? So he did that in 1904. Didn't work out quite well enough, and so he kind of went away for a couple of years, and in 1907 he launched the real Circuit Chautauqua. And it was really a clever thing. Basically what he did is he produced a 7-day Chautauqua. There was somebody would be on the ground for the whole 7 days, okay, the manager for that particular town. And they might have a few guys that would stay there the whole week. But mostly the entertainment was day by day. The day 1 entertainment would show up in Troy on Monday. They'd do their thing. They'd get on a train Monday night and go to Port Huron. And then they would do day 1 in Port Huron. Meanwhile, day 2 would show up on Troy and they'd do their day 2 thing on Tuesday. And then on Tuesday night, the day 1 people in Port Huron would move on to Fenton and do the day 1 thing in Fenton, while the day 2 people from Troy would go to Port Huron and the day 3 guys would come into Troy. And so essentially what you had was this sequence going through. Any one circuit was dealing with 7 towns all the time. So one circuit was dealing with 7 towns, a new town every day, right? And then the other really clever thing is, what they would do is they'd get the towns to foot the bill for the minimum charge for their Chautauqua. They'd have to pay up front, like in November, for what's going to happen next summer. They wouldn't know the dates, they wouldn't know the entertainment, but they'd pay up front, okay? And the reason they had to do that is, you can imagine the scheduling nightmare. You had to lay this thing out, and you needed time to get this laid out. You didn't have any program, you didn't have any apps that you could dial onto your phone to make this happen. This was all manual. It's all dependent on railroad schedules. But that's what the Circuit Chautauquas did. This actually is the contract. And here's the cool thing about the contract. This is Birmingham in 1915. There's a fee that's up in here. They had to sell so many tickets. There's a cost associated with that. All of these guys signed up. These are the city leaders of Birmingham. They signed up, and they were responsible to pay the cost. If Birmingham didn't sell the right number of tickets, anything that was short, these guys had to make up. Pretty clever model. And it worked pretty well. By 1913, there were 15 companies. I don't know how many circuits, because you could have one company might have a half a dozen circuits that they were running. 15 companies visiting 2,500 towns, getting a 1-week Chautauqua. By 1918, 8,000 towns were getting 1-week Chautauquas. It peaked in 1924. There were 24 companies. There were something like 95 circuits. And they visited 10,000 towns with 40 million people attending Chautauquas. And it started to go downhill from there. That was the 50th anniversary of Chautauqua, theoretically. I've never quite been able to figure out the number in Michigan. Michigan was kind of off the beaten path. At one point, I thought I had it nailed at 320 towns. That turned out to be not right, and so I've gone through the process of trying to count up using individual booking records that are very difficult to get. I think I've gotten up to north of 100 towns in Michigan, including Troy. But I don't really know how many. That's a to be determined kind of number. Okay. This gives you, just very quickly, a look at Holly in 1915, just to give you an idea of what these might look like. The Dunbar Male Quartet and Bell Ringers, they were a staple on the Chautauqua circuit. This Bohemian Girl play. Senator Ashers was really no great shakes as a politician, but he's around for a long time and a pretty dynamic speaker. Boardman was an expert in improving quality of life in towns, and so that's what he's doing. This is 1915. World War I's been going on now for 8 or 9 months. Here's a play on peace, okay? And then, again, the travelogues, the Chautauquas loved travel guys. Here's a guy who'd been exploring in South America, and then Wood Briggs was kind of a humorous storyteller. Now, this isn't the whole program. These are just a snapshot of some of the people that I pulled out of the Holly 1915 program. But it gives you an idea of the variety of stuff that was going on. The Circuit Chautauquas took a terrible beating from the elites, okay? Sinclair Lewis ripped the traveling Chautauquas to shreds in his book Main Street. But the fact is, you've got to remember that these people were living in very rural environments. They traveled by horse and buggy over terrible roads. The range of their life was about 6 or 7 miles, and then the Chautauqua would come to town. Was it high-class entertainment? Was it high-class information they were getting? Probably not most of the time. But what the heck did they have? See? It was a tremendous advance. So the fact is that these traveling Chautauquas had a real audience. But, like anything, there's an end. Part of the reason for the Chautauquas failing was, in fact, they accomplished their goals. The adult education theme, which is very important to Chautauquas, by the time you get to 1900, 1910, junior colleges, adult education programs, they exist all over the country. Okay? Public libraries are in towns all over the country, thanks to Andrew Carnegie, but Chautauquas had them first. Okay? You know, there's lots of things that Chautauqua did that simply became part of the staple. This, to some extent, is a Chautauqua event. Okay? Really, I think the community center in Birmingham, that just screams Chautauqua. You look at the variety of programming they have there, hell, that's just a Chautauqua that runs all year, in my view. This sort of stuff became staple in communities all over the country. And so you didn't need the Chautauquas. The Chautauquas in the 1890s, they overbuilt. They spent too much money. Their eyes were bigger than their pocketbooks, with some significant exceptions, Bayview being one of them. They didn't overspend. But Chautauqua in New York did. They got in trouble a couple of times. Miller bailed them out. John D. Rockefeller bailed them out a couple of times. Of course, John D. Rockefeller took something for that, I guess. I don't know that this was in his mind at all. But the guy who ran the Chautauqua University for, in the 1880s and the 1890s, he was hired to start the University of Chicago, which was funded by essentially John D. Rockefeller. And the guy who ran the athletic program at Chautauqua in 1890, 91, 92 was a fellow by the name of Amos Alonzo Stagg. Anybody hear of Amos Alonzo Stagg? Yes. Football coach at the University of Chicago. Is still the 7th leading most successful college football coach. He's a Newt Rockne guy. The Circuit Chautauquas come in and they compete with the independents. And because the circuits were, well, I don't want to get too harsh with them, they were a money-making operation. This was a business for these traveling Chautauquas. And they did whatever it took to turn a profit. By the time you get into the 1920s, I think it's pretty hard to distinguish between a Chautauqua and a vaudeville routine. They got to be very heavy entertainment-oriented, and it cheapened the brand quite a bit. But the big thing, I think, is that by the time you get into the mid-1920s, movies in every town in America. Everybody has a Model T Ford by now, so you can jump in your car and go to town. Your range is no longer 6 miles in your buggy and 2 hours. In those 2 hours, you can now go 40 miles in your Model T. It changes the world forever. And then, of course, in the mid-1920s, in comes the radio. So what'd you need a Chautauqua for? Okay. Lakeside started showing movies in the 1920s. Bayview started showing movies in the 1920s. Okay? Well, and then the real nail in the coffin is the Great Depression, which was the death knell for many things, including the Chautauquas. And what you have left today, if you're interested, what you should do is go look up the Chautauqua Trail on Google, and you're going to find these places where Chautauquas still function. Now, the biggies are Ocean Grove, Chautauqua, Ocean Park, Bayview, Lakeside, and then I'm really not sure about Mount Eagle. I think is pretty complete, but they may not be full season and they may not be full-blown Chautauquas in the sense that I think of a Chautauqua, but they're there. Almost all of these, with a couple of exceptions. Ypsilanti was not. Chagrin Falls, I don't think was. I don't think Plains, Georgia was. But most of these were old 1880, 1890, or before Chautauquas that have been around for over 100 years. Go there. Go to Lakeside, and you're stepping back in time 150 years. It is a wonderful way to spend a few days. So there you go. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Yep.
Were there any Chautauquas on the eastern side of the Hudson River, like in New England?
There were, but not many. The most prominent one that I know of is the Ocean Grove in Maine. I think it's Ocean Grove or Ocean Park, one of the two. One's in New Jersey, one's in Maine. Yes?
It seems like it was a very important movement, and how did you get involved in studying about this?
When I was 18, I was hitchhiking out east. I got picked up by this woman and her 2 kids, and she said, you know what a Chautauqua is? I said, no. She said, well, stay with me. So I spent the night with her and her kids on the porch. They had a family cottage that they'd been going to for 3 generations. I slept on the porch. That night, I went to see Al Hurt. In the morning, I went to a lecture by somebody from the State Department on events in Southern Africa, and I had to choose what to do.
Oh, wow.
So that's where I got hooked on Chautauquas. And since then, I taught history for 13 years, and my kids knew about Chautauquas.
Do you know what the meaning of the word Chautauqua is?
Yeah, it's and nobody knows for sure, but it's probably some combined bastardization of an Indian word and a French word. One of the stories is it's a bag tied in the middle, which sort of describes the shape of Lake Chautauqua. Whether or not that's true or not, I don't think anybody really knows. Yep. I do have a couple of books up here on some of the topics that I have finished. I haven't finished my Chautauqua book, but on the Second Great Awakening, and then on the Good Roads Movement, there's a couple of books up here. They're $10 a pop. She Who Must Be Obeyed will collect money if you are interested. Yes.
Was the Bayview that you spoke of, is that located in the Michigan Thumb?
It's up near Petoskey.
Okay.
It's up near Petoskey, up here. All right. Okay, thank you very much.